This is a short tutorial on how to set up hair for Daz Studio dForce using the Geometry Editor tool. I've been using dForce with hair since it was released, and I've had a fair amount of success with the methods illustrated in this tutorial. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the original 2-hour version. I'm just going to go over the techniques and methods I use so you can jump right in. So let's get to it. For this tutorial, I'll be using the lustrous hair on base Genesis 2 female. These methods should work on any similar hair that is made up of various strips. There are a few hair pieces that are more difficult to work with using these techniques. For example, the Genesis Love Me hair, which is a beautiful piece but has so many overlapping and intersecting strips that it's very difficult to work with. Also, hair with lots of curls, like the Riva Updo, because the curls tend to melt completely. But I'm still working on that one. So first, let's go over what we're going to do here. Using Daz Studio's Geometry Editor tool, we're going to create some new surfaces which dForce will work on. The problem with dForce and hair is that hair tends to fall apart. This is because there are no seams, as with clothing, and it doesn't fold over the body, so there's no anchor points. The individual strips that make up the hair will separate if you just add a dForce modifier and run the simulation. So we'll use the Geometry Editor to create these anchor points, which will allow dForce to run on the rest of the hair. Now we're going to need the following panes open, or at least available. Scene, Surfaces, Parameters, Simulation Settings, and Tool Settings. You may also want the timeline at the bottom, since we can set dForce to run over the length of a series of frames. The results may be more pleasing if you give the simulation more time to run. It depends on what you're after. So, what I've done here is set up the Lights and Cameras tab as my dForce workspace for the purposes of this tutorial. I have a figure in the scene because I want to name the new surfaces for that region of the head and body that they relate to, so it's easier to work with when I start adjusting the dForce parameters. So let's look at the hair first. Alright, so we'll hide the figure in the scene, and my viewport is draw style is set to hidden line because I need to see the mesh. And then select the hair. Now, go to the Tool Settings pane. There we go. Tool Settings. Come up here to Active Tool and make sure Geometry Editor is selected. You can click that, drop down, Geometry Editor. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. Now, all we need here is the surfaces group. It's got face groups, surfaces, and regions. All we need are the surfaces. Now, you see, for the lustrous hair, there are 4 groups. There's the base, middle, skull cap, and top. While dForce applies to the whole hair figure, skull caps will be set to 0, so we won't be working with that here. So we can hide that. There we go. Now, it doesn't matter which of the remaining 3 layers you start with because we will be working with all of them. So just to keep things moving, let's start at the top of the list with the base. So we'll hide the top, and we'll hide the middle, and we'll select the base. Now, as you can see, if you look at the base, it doesn't go all the way to the top of the head. So it just goes right above the ears. So we can go back here, bring in the figure, look at it, and say it's just right above the ears. So what we're going to do is, let's see. Alright, the Geometry Editor will not affect whatever isn't visible in the scene. So, go back here to Tool Settings. Right. So if you look at the base, you see it doesn't go all the way to the top of the head, but just above the ears. We're going to set this top row or two. Well, we'll do the top row as our anchor points. So we'll right-click on the mesh, go to Selection Mode, make sure Marquee Selection, and line the camera up, and then we'll just drag, catch all those top row of polygons there. And let's see. If you're not familiar with the geometry editor, the marquee selection and lasso selection modes will select through the mesh and are better for selecting large groups of polygons at once. The drag selection mode allows you to pick individual polys but will not penetrate the mesh. We can select large groups at first and then clean things up with the drag mode. So we'll do that here, since all I want is this top row, but I managed to catch the second row on these side pieces. So we'll right click, selection mode, drag selection, and then we'll hold the Alt key and boop it boop boop boof. Boof. Let's see, that overlaps. So I have to go on the inside, boof, and deselect it. And then on here, poof da boof, boof da boof. And same thing. Now, check and make sure that we've only got selected what we want selected. And now this selected portion is going to be our anchor point, or root system, basically, for this layer of hair. Now, we have our anchor points selected. The right-click menu, when you right-click on the mesh, this appears to have more options than the menu bar up here, or at least it's easier to get to. So we'll stick with this for now. So now we've got this area selected. Now we want to go down to Geometry Selection, Invert Selection, and now everything else is selected instead. So we're going to right-click on this, Geometry Assignment, Create Surface from Selected, and we're just going to name this, well, you can name this whatever you want to name it, but since it's built off the base and it is the dynamic portion of the base layer, I like to keep it all grouped. And once I'm done, I like to keep all my dynamic stuff close together. So I name everything dynamic, and then for the layer it is, and that's it for now on this. All right, so this is our dynamic base. And click accept, boom, we get a new surface over here that says dynamic base right under regular base. So we're done with the base. We can hide that, because that's like the skull cap, it's not going to have dynamic strength applied to it. We don't want it to, because we don't want it to fall apart. That's our anchor point. So now what we can do with the rest of this, we can either leave it like this and just hit it with the dForce and move on, and it will do its thing. It won't be as nice, but depends on what you want. All right. Let's see. Here were my notes. Now there are a couple of ways we can proceed here. Like I said, we can leave it like it is and just move on to the next layer and say, here's some dynamic hair. Yay, look at it go. It didn't fall apart. All right. But since this is a tutorial, let's split this up into multiple pieces. This will give us the maximum level of control over the dynamic properties later on. So again, there are a couple of different ways we can split this up. We can continue creating layers with the marquee tool. So we can go in and say right click, selection mode, marquee. You can go in and say this, and this, and then assign that to a new surface, and then once we're done with that, we go down to the next piece and we select that. We say that's a new surface that will get dynamics, and then this is a new section, and on down like that. Which, since this would select both front and back, I'm not too fond of that. We will do something similar to that, but first we're going to actually separate these front from the back, because we have these two front strips that go over the front of the body and this one big solid back section. Okay, so what we're going to do here at the very least is split these up. Now you can, all these individual strips, you can select them all individually with the drag selection and try to separate them and get like absolute maniacally tight control over the entire hair by having each individual strip as a separate entity. I've tried that. It's very tedious, and I don't recommend it. I'm sure it would, if you could get it to come out, I'm sure it would be like awesome for the control level, but getting to that point, very tedious. Let's see. Right, well, since we have these two sections that drape over the front of the figure, we can select one of them using the marquee tool to separate it from the rest. So, let's see. Actually, this would probably work best with the lasso. So we'll go up here like this, and we'll select that, and we'll say boom. And then, see, that has selected that entire left side. We've got a little bit up here to clean up. So right click, selection mode, drag selection, and then control click to add these missing polygons on that side, yada yada. We make sure that we didn't get any part of the back. Doesn't look like we did. Alright, so we can right click, geometry assignment, create surface from selected, and we can call that dynamic base front left. And boom. So we go over here, hide that, select our dynamic base again, and we'll do the same thing on this side. Right click, selection mode, lasso. Just draw this around that front strip like so. And clean it up, right click, selection mode, drag selection, control, and if you hold down Alt, you can deselect and drag, hold down Control, select and drag, and let's see, so that's the right side. So now we will right click, geometry assignment, create surface, and this will be dynamic base front right. So we have dynamic base front left, and now we have dynamic base front right. Now we will hide that, and now what we're left with is the back. But since this portion also goes up along the back of the head of the figure, what we can do is split this up at the very least into, the back of the head, and then the neck, and then back, down the back further, and that will give us like really detailed control over the dynamics. Like I said, the more you have to work with, the better control you have over it. So, and this is a pretty long piece of hair here, so I mean, you can, there we go. What? Visibility, thank you. Now, you can see how I've just messed this up. Dynamic base. Thank you very much, computer. Now, you can see how far down this goes, And you can make this actually longer through the morphs, so to come with it. So, imagine that. Now, like I said, it's a long enough piece. For a piece this size and this big, which most of them, the back is like this. It's this one big solid piece. If you were to apply dForce to it right now, it would kind of separate, but you see these little pinkish areas, darker pink areas? This is where these meshes overlap and intersect with each other, actually. And if you were to apply dForce to them right now, you'd have one side pulling to the left, one side pulling to the right, but they'd be, intersecting and tugging against each other. So we want to try at least to get them separate from each other. But what I'm going to do first is selection mode, marquee, and I want to get this down to the base of the neck, or the base of the head, top of the neck, and I want to set that as a separate piece because that will not be as dynamic as the rest of it. So right click, geometry assignment, create surface from selected. We'll say dynamic base skull. Just some sort of identifier that tells us that it is dynamic. It's built off the base layer and what region of the figure that it's near. That way, when we go to apply dynamics later on, we can and adjust the intensity of the dynamics. We can say, okay, well, this part doesn't get as much, this gets more, yada yada. We know where it is. All right, so I mean, I have done this before, and I've ended up with 33 separate, just the dynamics, in addition to the original original 4 surfaces, which didn't get dynamics, but just the ones that did have dynamics applied, 33, and that was all 3 layers, the base, middle, and top layer. This can get intense, but hopefully we won't get that intense here. All right, so now I still have my dynamic base. Now what I'm going to do here is we can split this up just into left and right and be done with it. Left will follow the left, right will follow the right, but we have this center strip that's kind of woven, actually, right down the center. So what we can do, we can right click, selection mode, drag selection, and just go through and select that center strip. We'll just do a rough selection now, then we'll come back and clean it up. And let's see, control, This is a little bit tedious. You can change the size of this selection radius tool, but because it's round, you run the risk of selecting a whole lot of the neighboring mesh, which then you have to go back and clean up by setting the size down. So you could also do this if you have a steady enough hand with the lasso selection, but you see how that overlaps there. So you need to get behind it, get around it, under it, and then spin around so we can look at the back and see. Here we've got some that, whoops, alt select from the neighboring mesh that we didn't want. And that's part of that poke through that it has. Now, because it's part of the poke through that it has, it also has this. And this can get very tedious. Especially when you have to move the camera around and it rotates and moves what you're looking for out of the view because the rotational center is not to your liking. It's not conducive to this sort of work. I mean, it's in the dead center, yeah, so, which is where it's supposed to be, but it's still annoying. It's annoying. There, okay, so there is that center strip, and hopefully only the center strip, and hopefully all of the center strip. And so we will right-click, geometry assignments, create surface, and we shall call this dynamic base back mid, and boom. And once we hide that, hardar, and select dynamic base again, we are left with the left and right booms. Now we can further subdivide this to get like maximum control, but for this we won't, because we've got a lot of work to do, and I promise not to give you a 2-hour tutorial here. Marquee selection, drag right down the middle, we'll select the right half. Right, so right click, select mode, drag selection, control click to clean this up here. I mean, I could do a 2-hour YouTube video tutorial on this, but do you really want to sit here and watch a 2-hour tutorial on how to do this? Alright, there it is. Alright, so right click, geometry assignment, create surface. We shall call this dynamic base back right. Dynamic base back right. That's the right, that's the back. Both. Okay, and we hide that. Oh, and look what we're left with. So we can double click that, dynamic, and rename it dynamic base back left. And enter, and boom, we're done with that. How's about that? All right. So now let's move on to the middle.